Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the History of BBC Micro Typing Games, where I look at game listings for the Beeb that featured in the many computing magazines of the 8-bit era, and of course play the actual games. First off, apologies for taking so long to produce this episode. I was hoping to complete it before I went on my big holiday to Australia and New Zealand in September, but time got away from me and then I struggled to find the time for over a month after I got back too, due to work commitments, home issues and a couple of weekends away. So again, sorry. In this episode, I'll round off my review of typing games from 1985, looking at another 5 publications, this time covering September to December of that year. As usual, I'll also try to pick out a few interesting articles from each mag as I go through them, so let's get started. First up this time around, I'm going to be looking at the September 1985 issue of Electron User magazine. I have featured this in a couple of previous videos, and this is obviously the spin-off from Micro User, focusing on the Acorn Electron. And front and centre on the cover here is the game that I'm going to be looking at in this magazine, Tex and Dan, and it says "Go West for our bumper game." Full listing inside, obviously, otherwise how am I going to look at it? You can see 2 cowboys fighting on the top of a giant Acorn Electron in the desert, with a cactus and a horse in the foreground. Other major features in this magazine that I'm not going to be looking at include learning about string variables, assembler graphics and easy file handling, playing bounce ball or stretching your mind with Reversi, and making sweet music with your Electron. But as I say, I'm not going to be looking at any of those, so let's jump inside. And straight away on the inside cover, there's an advert for Blue Ribbon Software, featuring screenshots of many of the games they had available at this point in time, including Castle Assault, Q-Man, Diamond Mine, Darts, Nightmare Maze, Screwball and more. What surprised me about this advert though is the price of the games. As you can see, they've got an RRP of just £2.50, so these were essentially budget games, which I never realised back in the day. As you can see from the bottom of the advert, they also did disc collections featuring 5 games for an RRP of £9.95, which would have been pretty good value if you're a disc user. As is fairly customary for these videos, I've now moved on to the news page to find out what was going on in the world of the Acorn Electron at this point in time. And the main headline here says Software House wraps soccer stars ransom, and goes on to say a number of leading British soccer heroes are attempting to hold UK software houses to ransom, according to a publisher of Electron titles. Footballing celebrities are said to be making extortionate demands for up to 75% of all profits to allow their names to be used to promote games. The more interesting story for me though is on the left hand side here, where it says Great Sale is on. The biggest Electron sale ever is underway as retailers, determined to clear shelf space, have been drastically slashing the prices of old stocks. An Electron user survey of major outlets has revealed that Electrons are selling for £100 and under at Macro, Lasky's, Asda and Safeway, less than shops were paying distributors for the machines just a few weeks ago. At Rumbelows the price was £120, but the likes of WH Smiths, Dixons and Boots were all holding on to the recommended retail price of £129. It goes on to say trade observers believe Smiths, Dixons and Boots will have to bring their prices down to compete against the dumpers. It also says the new low prices fixed by Macro, Lasky's and the like have angered smaller retailers who are stuck with the Electrons they paid more than £100 each for. I'm guessing this story was effectively signalling the death knell for the Electron as a commercial proposition. I've now moved on to page 39, the reviews section, which is entitled Software Surgery, the column that takes a look inside the latest releases. Titles reviewed in this issue include Drain Mania from Icon Software, an Electron Bumper Bundle from Alligator, Brian Jack's Superstar Challenge, and the game I'm going to take a closer look at, Repton from Superior Software. The review begins by saying Repton is the latest and claims to be the best release from Superior Software, one of the leading Electron software houses. It's one of those arcade adventure style games with you playing the part of the hero Repton. It then goes on to explain how to play the game, gives some technical information, and then says Repton is a colourful green-headed character and is beautifully animated. If you don't move him, he starts looking around of his own accord. And at the end of the review it says this is an astounding game reaching new heights in Electron arcade adventures, so if you feel that you're an Indiana Jones type then go out and buy it today. Not really sure I'd class Repton as an arcade adventure, but nevertheless that's a glowing review of the classic game on this system. Time to move on to the games listing then. This is on page 50, and as I've already mentioned, the game I'm looking at is Tex and Dan, and on the left hand corner it says Ride Out West with Ken Goodacre and do what a man's got to do, and below it is a sort of screenshot of the game. I can assure you when we look at the game itself it's a lot more colourful than this, but this does give you the layout of the screen, which as you can see is a sort of diagonal view of a classic Wild West town. The introduction to the game says tired of arcade action but don't want to hurt your brain with logic games? Well, why not go back to the days when a man was a man and do what a man has to do way out west. Despicable Dan has ridden into town and the scene is set for a showdown between Dan and Tex the Sheriff. Tex has 6 shots in his gun, which is reloaded when Dan has used his 6. Each player has 3 lives, and when Dan has lost all his lives the game moves on to the next level. On each progressive level, the number of shots Tex starts with is reduced, and to make things a little more difficult, Tex can only fire straight or at a preset angle left or right depending on his proximity to Dan. Points are also awarded for shooting pieces off a cacti, which can only be hit when firing straight up. It then goes on to say on the third screen, one of Dan's gang throws a rattlesnake onto Tex's side of the road. This snake proceeds to chase Tex for the rest of the game, but can be jumped over by pressing the spacebar. The overview is rounded up by saying as well as this one player versus the micro, there's also a 2-player option in which both players are evenly matched, and the game will also demonstrate itself, so this all sounds pretty promising from the overview. As with almost every listing in the micro user and Electron user, you get several box outs featuring a list of all the procedures used in the game, a list of all the main variables, and in this case also a separate section for some flags, although they are essentially just variables. The listing then begins on the right hand page, and this is a big one spanning 5.5 pages in total with a line count of over 650. As befits this magazine, the layout's pretty good with the text clearly printed across multiple columns per page, and it's nicely embellished with a couple of Wild West drawings too. In terms of the content of the listing, I'm not going to delve deeply into this one, but it is all written in BASIC and you can see on page 53 that it uses a lot of move and plot commands. If you've been following this series for a while, you probably expected that, because you can see from the screenshot there's a lot of diagonal lines being drawn. The only other thing I'm going to point out is that at the end of this listing there are a bunch of data statements, and the last few of them relate to music, so we're going to get some tunes in this game. And with that, let's take a look at it. The game begins with some very simple instructions just printed in plain green text on a black background. They detail the keyboard controls for players 1 and 2 and also advise that you can switch the sound on or off. Pressing spacebar then presents you with a pretty impressive title screen saying Tex and Dan from the Electron user, with a couple of cactuses on screen and also a cowboy that eventually gets shot and a small tunes played. From there you're then given the option to choose 1 or 2 players, but if you don't select anything then you're soon treated to a rolling demo of the game, which is a pretty nice touch for a basic listing. At any point during the demo you can press the spacebar to actually play the game yourself. As I already covered when I looked at the intro to the game in the magazine, the aim is simply to outgun your opponent, hitting them 3 times before they get you, which then moves you on to a more difficult level. This may just be a variant of the old Boot Hill arcade game done on an angle, but there are elements of this basic game that are really well done. As I've already mentioned, it's got great presentation with the demo mode and a choice of 2 players or a computer controlled opponent, and a pretty decent tunes played at the start of each game too. The graphics are pretty smart, with well drawn backgrounds, reasonably good player sprites and some neat details like all the doors in the street closing before the game starts, and the defeated player's body being taken away by the Undertaker at the end. Gameplay is of course quite simple, but having a limited number of shots means you have to think about when to fire. The reaction to the keyboard controls is a little slow, a common symptom of games written in BASIC, and you only seem to be able to hit the opponent straight on. The angled shots seem to be very hard to get on target. The third round against the computer is extremely hard to win. This stage onwards adds snakes that you have to jump over, but they're not really relevant as you tend to get shot so quickly. I did get past that stage once and it gets even harder, but the game design is good as you do get an extra man for winning a round, giving you a better chance of making further progress. With simplistic gameplay this isn't going to keep you occupied for long, but the game is well implemented for the most part and would offer more fun with 2 human players, so it might have been worth the effort of typing in despite being such a hefty listing. The next magazine is the first of 2 from November 1985, and this is Your Computer, Britain's biggest selling home computer magazine, they say. The big feature on the front cover is the scoop about next year's Sinclair Enigma, plus a Spectrum 128, and I'm going to be taking a look at the articles for both of those. Also featured in this issue includes what to buy for Christmas, top micros and disk drives, Commodore 64 Tower of Antics and BBC Kung Fu, which is a type-in listing I'm going to be looking at, and also a competition to save the Goonies and win a treasure chest. Moving to page 17, there's some BBC Micro focused content with this advert for Doctor Who and the Mines of Terror, which is very confusing to read. It says, "Are you ready for brain-to-brain combat?" but you could read that text in a number of ways and completely baffle yourself. This was at this point an upcoming game for the BBC Micro from Micropower, and there's more information about it a few pages further on in the news section. The headline says Doctor Who and the Micro ROMs, and the article says ROM chips have got cheaper. Some EPROMs are reportedly available for a quarter of their January price, which has literally created ROM to move for claustrophobic programmers sweating away trying to produce epics in 32 or 48k of memory. I assume that was a pun on room to move there, but it wasn't a very good one. It goes on to say at least 2 software houses are using sideways ROMs to expand the memory of a specific computer so that it can run a specific games program. It first talks about Shadow of the Unicorn for the Spectrum, but the BBC focus is Doctor Who and the Mines of Terror, which I just looked at the advert for, which it says is Micropower's foray into the land of sideways ROM. For $18.95 you get another 16k of memory and a very large platform game. The aim of the game is to recapture the plans of the TARDIS time machine and destroy the Master's factory. Based on the popular sci-fi TV series, it lacks Daleks but has plenty of problem solving. Due to the requirements for the ROM cartridge and the fact that I had virtually no original games back in the day, I've never played this one, but it was ported to the Commodore 64, so maybe one day I will. Moving a little deeper into the magazine, there's this advert for the Atari ST, the release of which had been previewed earlier in 1985, and I looked at that in a couple of magazines in previous episodes. This advert's from the famous Silica shop who advertised heavily in all the computer magazines throughout the 80s and early 90s, and the Atari 520 ST, described as being power without the price, retails at this point at £749, for which you get 512k of RAM, a mouse, the GEM operating system, a black and white monitor, a 500k 3.5-inch disk drive and a 95-key keyboard. At this point, this was clearly being marketed as a serious business machine, as it didn't come bundled with any games, and you can see here it being compared with other high-value business machines such as the Apple Mac and the Apricot F1e. In the coming years, of course, it'd have a significant price cut and be repositioned predominantly as a games machine. I've now moved on to look at that article about the Spectrum 128K that was mentioned on the front cover. I'm not going to dig into this in too much detail, but there are a couple of things I want to pick out. Firstly, there's a picture of Sinclair's new machine with this interesting keypad attachment on the right hand side, and in the top right hand corner it says Scoop, too little too late or a new step forward for Sinclair. With a little help from our Spanish friends at Micro Hobby Week, we sneak a look at the Spectrum 128 built by Investronica. So this is actually a prototype of the Spectrum 128 that was given to a Spanish magazine to review, and your computer magazine's got their mitts on it to have a look as well. Skipping over the first two paragraphs, the more interesting bit of information here is that the UK launch would be the following spring, so that's 1986, and the 128 will cost around £150, whereas a Spanish Sinclair would have set you back £100 more. So it seems that this version of the Spectrum was going to come out in Spain first, and the reason for that is that the summer's financial problems have forced Clive Sinclair to sell his soul to the devil, or rather Dixon's. They agreed to take the mountainous drifts of surplus QLs and Spectrum Pluses off his hands if he agreed not to launch any new products in the UK until well after Christmas. The article then goes on to give a thorough overview of the new system, but I'm going to leave it to you to look at that if you want to. What I'm going to look at though is this box out in the bottom left, which compares the Spectrum 128 to other 128K machines that are hitting the market at the same time. It says the Commodore 128 has better graphics, sound and software and costs £275. The Amstrad 6128 includes CPM, monitor and disc but less games, and that's £300. The much less well-known Enterprise 128 includes word processor, joystick but almost no software and costs £250, and the Atari 130XE has brilliant games but not as many as for the Spectrum, but still tops for sound and vision and costs £170. The final paragraph of this preview of the system says there may be some changes before it appears on the British market next spring, but despite its faults, the 128 looks like it'll be a strong base model for Sinclair's new 1986 range, which will also include the portable Pandora and the desktop Enigma, which is on the next page. And over the page it says next year's model from Sinclair is the Enigma, and it says can it be good enough to take on the ST and Amiga on their own ground. So this looks to be what Sinclair was intending to offer in the 16-bit home computer market, and it's depicted by this line drawing. There's no actual photos because the ones at the bottom here are for the Amiga and Atari ST, which are deemed to be its competitors. The artist's impression shows a keyboard, mouse, 2 disk drives and a colour monitor, so pretty much the standard setup for 16-bit computers. But the big thing here is this never actually got released as far as I know. I can find out very little about this system on the internet, so if you've got any more information, let me know in the comments. Time now to move on to the game listing from this magazine, and this is Kung Fu Master, and you can see a screenshot of it on the left hand side here that looks quite impressive, and then randomly another screenshot inset from that. It also says that this is available on Telsoft, which is presumably some kind of bulletin board service. The overview of the game is written by the programmer Brian Lewis and says Kung Fu Master is fairly unusual as magazine listings go, as it allows either Electron or BBC users to type in the program as it stands, and the program itself detects which machine it's running on and makes any necessary changes to the program automatically. This is achieved by reading the value of the INKEY 256 command. It goes on to say the game is standard karate style where each player can execute a certain number of moves, in this case 10, in order to attack his opponent or defend himself. The unusual thing about this game is the size and quality of the graphics, each player being 64 pixels or 8 characters high. Such large characters would normally take a large chunk out of the already limited memory, and would also result in a huge amount of data which would have to be typed in by the user. To get around this problem, I've used a simple but still effective compression technique. Each character is stored in miniature form, in this case 4 characters high, and then this is expanded up to the full 8 characters by the printing routine. It then goes on to give a list of all the moves and keyboard controls before saying all 4 listings should be typed in and saved one after the other on the same cassette. And Brian rounds off by saying if you don't want to type the game in but do wish to play it, send him a blank cassette and a large stamped address envelope and he'll record the game for you free of charge. A very generous offer there from Brian, who lists his home address. Data protection really wasn't a thing in the mid-80s, was it? So as it mentioned, there are 4 listings to type in here, and all of them have been crammed onto these 2 pages. And that means you would have had to get your magnifying glass out to read listings 2, 3 and 4, as the text is absolutely tiny. The text size on the first listing is a little bit more readable, and as you can see, that consists of a ton of data statements to type in. Listings 2 and 3 are very hard to read, but I can see that there's a load of machine code statements to type in there, and the final listing is pretty short and presumably ties the other 3 together. Between the 4 listings is about 130 lines of code to type in, which is actually not that bad considering how good the game looks. Let's now find out if there's any substance to go with that style. The game begins by drawing a red sun and mountainous backdrop on the screen using the Beeb's graphical plotting commands, before displaying a title screen with the 2 combatants at either side. A staple of 8-bit home computer games, the scrolling message is displayed saying "Play Kung Fu Master if you dare, a game of skill and determination, where intelligence and swiftness are essential to stay alive." Pressing space then starts the game, and this is a pretty standard one-on-one martial arts combat game for the era, with the 2 fighters facing off on a single screen with the aim of wearing down the opponent's health bar to defeat them. The first problem I had with this game is that it's 2-player only, so I had to control both fighters myself. The combat therefore doesn't look very fluid in my footage, though there are other reasons for that too. The graphics are really impressive, with a smartly drawn background and detailed if slightly blocky characters with good animation for the moves. There are just basic sound effects for punches and kicks, but a good tune is played when the game ends. There's a decent variety of moves that have different levels of damage, and the ability to block too, so it does have the fundamentals of a good fighting game. The keyboard controls work fairly well and are responsive, but it's hard to remember all the combinations required for each move. The game sadly falls down due to the really slow movement of the 2 fighters, and the biggest problem is that you can't go past the middle of the screen, so both players have to cooperate to actually engage in combat. There's no time limit to add any urgency to win, and you have a large energy bar, so matches could conceivably go on forever. This is undoubtedly one of the most graphically impressive games I've seen in this series thus far, but it needs some serious work to make it a playable and fun fighting game. Giving the players the ability to get past that invisible force field in the middle of the screen and adding a computer controlled opponent would be an excellent start, if there was enough memory available to do so. For the 3rd magazine in this episode, I'm sticking with November 1985 and that month's edition of Beebug magazine, which I've featured in several previous episodes and is entirely focused on the BBC Micro because Beebug stands for the BBC Micro User Group. To be fair, there's probably some Electron coverage in there as well. This issue's got a pretty weird front cover, as all it does is say Beebug in a number of different styles and colours down the page. That's to illustrate the fact that there's a program inside this edition that deals with hidden line removal, as it says on the front there. I couldn't really find anything in this edition that stood out as being particularly interesting. For example, there's no game or software reviews in this issue, so what I'm going to do is just skim through it quickly and point out some of the key articles. If you're interested in reading them in more detail, you can do so at your leisure by downloading the PDF of this magazine from the link provided in the pinned comment. Articles in this issue include building your own database manager, Beebug Filer, compressing screen displays, WordWise Plus program compactor, ROM utilities for all, another WordWise Plus article dealing with programming, that program mentioned on the front cover about hidden line removal, which does look quite interesting to be fair. It says you can turn your wireframe displays into solid looking 3D objects with this technique for hidden line removal. There's a couple of before and after screenshots at the bottom of the first page that show this program in action, and the listing itself covers the following 3 pages, with more examples at the bottom of 2 of them. The Beebug Workshop this time deals with virtual arrays. There's a feature about programming sideways RAM and ROM. And finally, towards the end of this issue is the game listing, which is for Quasimodo, and you can probably already guess what game this is inspired by the 2 screen captures shown. The introduction for this one says Jonathan Temple rings the changes with this colourful 11-screen game for the BBC Micro. Surprise, surprise, it's for the BBC Micro in this entirely BBC Micro focused publication. It then gives a very elaborate overview of the game, which is of course a clone of the arcade game Hunchback. So I'll skip over all that and move on to the program notes, which say the data for the 11 screens is held in lines 2840 to 2890, with 4 numbers for each screen. The first number represents the type of screen, where 0 is a flat wall, 1 represents turrets, 2 is a pit with a rope, and 3 is a pit with platforms. It then says that the next 3 numbers represent the chance of an arrow, rope and boulder appearing respectively. If 0, it will not appear on that screen at all. The chance is decided using the RND function along with the number in the data. If that's equal to 1, then a new arrow or boulder is made to appear. So that makes it sound like there's a random element to the appearance of those hazards, but it then goes on to say the RND function is seeded, which means that the numbers produced will be the same every game. It does however then say that if Quasimodo should reach Esmeralda, when he starts the game again, the seed for RND is changed, which means that some of the screens the player will have to learn a new route, so that's pretty clever. After some more information about how jumping is achieved, details of a useful procedure that triples the height of text, and information about how the sound's used in the game, the listing then begins, and it covers almost 3 pages, though there are some more screenshots on the second and third ones. The overall line count is just under 300, and the whole programme is written in BASIC. You can see everything you'd expect from a basic game listing if you've been watching this series from the beginning, including VDU statements to define the character sprites and procedures for all the main elements in the game, including ones to initialise the game, draw the screen, print the score and deal with elements such as arrows, ropes and jumping. It's all pulled together at the beginning of the listing with the main program loop that calls all those procedures. So from the screenshots and the description of the game, we know exactly what we're getting here. The only question is it any good? The game begins with a reasonable instructions screen, and you can see the use of that triple height text procedure at the top. You get a much briefer overview here than you did in the magazine, saying in this version of the well-known arcade game you must guide Quasimodo through the 11 screens to his sweetheart Princess Esmeralda. The hero must avoid the arrows and rocks the cruel guards are throwing at him, and use the ropes to swing across the dangerous gaps. The keyboard controls are then given, which is Z and X for left and right, and return to jump. To complete each screen, of course, Quasimodo must jump up to the bell rope and ring the bell. There's also the ability to pause and unpause the game with Control and Shift. That does it for the instructions, and you then press spacebar when you want to start the game. The first screen is then drawn with Quasimodo on the left hand side, and as I'm sure you know, all we have to do to complete the game is make his way across each of the progressively more difficult screens from left to right, avoiding any hazards and ringing the bell at the right hand side. This clone of the arcade game has pretty good graphics for a basic listing, which are clearly aimed at recreating the look of the superior software version of the game, and doing a fair job aside from a poor single coloured main sprite. The sound effects are simple noises for running, jumping and ringing the bell, but that's all you get in any other version of the game, and they compare favourably enough. The controls are generally responsive, though the character's reaction to hitting the jump button does seem to register too late sometimes. The game also suffers from some serious slowdown the more moving objects there are on the screen. It's initially quite hard, but each screen just requires practice and good timing to get through. Stage 3 can be infuriating until you work out the timing for jumping onto the rope, and the following screen is also tricky as you're best to just keep moving and time the jumps just right. That can be difficult at times though due to the aforementioned response times when hitting the jump button. The overall presentation is quite basic, although it does have score, lives and bonus displayed on screen. There's no title screen or high score table though, but it might be possible to add these as the listing isn't too big. This is really not a bad clone of the excellent superior version of Hunchback, which is definitely playable and probably completable with enough practice. At the time it was published, it would have made a reasonable alternative to many of the commercial versions that were available, albeit with fewer screens. The last 2 magazines I'm going to be looking at in this episode are both from December 1985, and first I'm going to be looking at that month's edition of the Acorn User. The front cover features an image representing the featured game in this issue, Shuggy's Garden, which is the one I'm going to be looking at, and I've chosen this one because I remember having this magazine back in 1985 and typing this game in, but I've got absolutely no memory of the actual game, so I think what probably happened was I either gave up halfway through typing it in, or I typed it in but never got it to work. Aside from promoting that typing game, there's not a lot else of interest on the front cover, it all sounds rather boring. So let's jump inside, and first up on page 82 and 83 is a double page spread advertising BBC games from US Gold. As it says at the bottom here, US Gold on the BBC, now you can play the game too. And in the middle there it says the best of America coming this autumn, which is a bit of a strange thing for it to say when this is a winter edition of the magazine. I assume it was the preceding autumn rather than the next one. Anyway, below the massive metallic BBC in the middle of the page is the imagery from the various game covers that US Gold were famous for, and across the top are the 6 games that are going to be released or have already been released on the BBC Micro: Bounty Bob Strikes Back, Beachhead, Bruce Lee, Raid Over Moscow, Dam Busters and Impossible Mission. There are also some screenshots, but as it says in the bottom right corner, all screenshots shown are the Commodore 64 versions, and you can certainly tell that from the screenshot of Bruce Lee with that abundance of brown. Anyway, it's a really nice advert, and it would have been great for BBC owners to see that US Gold were willing to support their system with some of their great games in the run-up to Christmas 1985. Moving much deeper into the magazine to page 173, we've got the charts for the top 20 BBC Micro games and also the top 10 Electron games. If you've seen other episodes in this series, you'll know that I do like to look at a game chart in each one. Something of a surprise to me though was that Match Day from Ocean is the #1 game going into Christmas 1985. Not a game I've ever played on the Beeb. When you consider the likes of Revs, Elite and Repton are in the top 10, it's quite a surprise that Match Day tops them all. There are a few noteworthy BBC Micro exclusives in the chart, though they all feature near the bottom, such as Wizardor, Boffin and Castle Quest, and there are also some very recognisable cross-platform titles, such as Ultimate's Attic Attack, Alienate and Night Law, Durrell's Combat Links and US Gold's Beachhead, which proves that some of those US Gold games had been released by this point in time. Beachhead's also at #1 in the top 10 Electron games, which as you'd expect also features a number of popular titles including Elite, Gremlins, Combat Links, Repton and Football Manager. There's also a couple of Firebird budget games in there, Bird Strike and Hacker, both of which are featured on a special BBC Micro focused episode of the Silverbird selection some years ago. I've now moved to the back cover and this advert for some technology that is pure 80s. This is the Seiko RC1000 wrist terminal, described as the greatest breakthrough in wrist technology since Seiko introduced quartz. And there's a picture of it here, seemingly connected to a BBC Micro. As you can see, it's got a number of buttons on it, including time, lock, alarm, up and down buttons that say select and set below them, and also a terminal button. The write-up says only Seiko's advanced microelectronics technology could have produced the RC1000. It is in fact a computer terminal, miniaturised and then fitted to a small stylish module to be worn on your wrist like a watch, ready to recall important data from your personal computer anytime, anywhere. It has a 24-character screen and extensive memory that holds up to 80 screen pages of information that can be subdivided into 12 separate data files. A detachable lead allows it to interface with the RS-232 port of your computer, and a sophisticated menu-driven database allows you swift access to your files. Following a further overview of some of the features, at the bottom it says the RC1000 is $99.95 at all good computer specialists, and below that it lists the systems that it's compatible, which include the IBM PC, Apple II, Epson PX8, yeah I don't know what that is either, the BBC Model B, Commodore 64 and Sinclair Spectrum. Sorry Amstrad users, this tech wasn't available to you. So, did anyone watching this video ever have an RC1000 wrist terminal from Seiko? If so, please let me know in the comments what it was like. Time to move on to the game listing from this magazine now, and this is Shuggy's Garden. As I mentioned, it was on the front cover, although the headline here says Round and Round the Garden. Underneath that though, it says add a little extra fun to your Christmas with our exciting game Shuggy's Garden. Deep in the garden, a monster is lying in wait, watching you collect the autumn apples, so look out. The introduction says here's a game for you to type in over Christmas after you've filled yourself with turkey and are fed up with your other presents. Shuggy's Garden will run on both the BBC Micro and the Electron, and you'll find details of how to enter the listing on yellow page 107, so I'll move to that later. It goes on to say the scenario is autumn in Shuggy's Garden. All the apples are ripening and he would love dearly to collect them, but a monster has entered the orchard intent on bringing about his demise. Causing yet more chaos, the leaves are falling off the trees, threatening to crush poor Shuggy. There's then a wealth of information on how to play the game, but I'm going to skip over that because that'll all be covered in the instructions when I look at the actual game. I'm going to move on instead to the program details, and at the bottom here it says for speed the program contains 2 short sections of assembly language. The first is used to determine the character at the current text cursor position using OSByte 135. It goes on to say the second section of code is a general purpose routine to print multicoloured characters on the screen, and there's plenty of information about how it does that, and it then says this can easily be adapted to your own data, and with some alterations larger characters can be printed. There's further information about some of the other routines used in the program, and below that is a large box art featuring all the variables, functions and procedures that you'll find in the listing. So plenty of information there if you want to understand how the program hangs together, but let's now move on to those yellow pages to see the listing itself. So here are those yellow pages that contain all the listings from the magazine, and boy are they yellow. As promised, the listing for Shuggy's Garden starts on page 107, and it begins with an overview of how to type the program in, and as it mentioned earlier in the magazine, there are 3 listings to be typed in that have to be saved sequentially on cassette. The 3 programs span across 4 pages overall, with a line count across them of just over 450. As mentioned earlier in the magazine, the first two listings, which are quite short, contain some assembly language, but aside from that, the main program is all in BASIC and it's laid out quite nicely. The yellow background actually makes the black text stand out quite well, and it's printed at a good size and spaced out well too, so it's pretty easy to read. All of this makes me wonder why I had problems typing this in when I was a kid, to be honest, but if it didn't work, perhaps it's because there was actually a bug in there somewhere. As I mentioned, I really have no memory of ever getting this game to work, so let's now see what I've missed out on. When the game loads up, you get a whopping 4 pages of instructions, so rather than you seeing those while I talk through them, I'm just going to start the gameplay footage. The aim of Shuggy's Gardens is to guide Shuggy around the gardens collecting the apples as they appear, while avoiding the ravenous monster. As you attempt this already difficult task, piles of fallen leaves accumulate which bar your path. If the monster reaches an apple before you do, he will eat it and you'll lose 100 points and forfeit 2 of your hard-earned apples. The mushroom is the monster's home, and if you eat that then he becomes infuriated and will chase you, laying a trail of leaves behind him. You can't pass through the leaves that fall continuously, but the monster can. As they always fall along the path you've taken, if you hang around too long or retrace your steps you could find yourself getting squashed. To help you, a flashing square indicates where the next pile of leaves is going to fall. There are 4 different gardens and the monster speeds up through them, starting at about 1/5 of your speed and progressing to half your rate on the 4th screen. Also increasing will be the number of apples you have to collect, which will increment by 3 for every level completed. When you've completed the 4th screen, you'll return to the 1st screen and the number of apples and speed of the monster will be lowered, but the catch is that the leaves now fall more frequently, which makes navigating around the screen more difficult. You get 100 points for each apple collected, 1000 for the mushroom and 1 point for each square of grass covered. At first glance, this game has similarities to arcade classics like Dig Dug or Mr. Do, but the objective is different. It's a much more fast-paced collect 'em up with risk-reward mechanics in relation to collecting the mushroom. You need to keep moving almost all the time to stop yourself from being blocked in, and have very good reactions to avoid the enemy. It gets very difficult after the first few stages, as you have to keep an eye on where the apples are spawning, the monster location and the number of apples remaining to get through unscathed. The controls are very responsive, which is essential in such a fast-paced game, and there's no slowdown as the number of moving objects on screen is minimal. The level layout resets when you lose a life, but the number of apples remaining doesn't, so you can potentially use that to milk more points from the mushroom if you're struggling to complete a stage anyway. That's clearly not a long-term technique though, as you soon run out of lives. The presentation is pretty good, with the status panel that has all the required information and a high score table too. The graphics are simple but well designed, making use of machine code to generate multicoloured sprites and objects. The in-game music is a nice touch, but it's a short tune and eventually gets annoying, while the sound effects are typical arcade style bleeps. It would benefit from having more levels or adding different monsters or power-ups, as it does get a little repetitive, but overall this isn't bad. The concept is familiar but still has some originality, and it's a well implemented arcade style game. The final magazine I'm going to be looking at this time is the Trusty Micro User, and obviously this is the December 1985 edition, and you didn't need to look at the information at the top of the front cover to work that out, because it's got a very festive look to it, with the snow covered street and a shop with Christmas lights in the window. Also in the window is a BBC Micro. The delights offered in this issue based on the front cover include creating your own word puzzles, an article comparing ADFS or DFS 2.20, the opportunity to survive the Wizard's Castle, which is a game I'm going to be looking at, revealing the mysteries of multiplexing, and 2 cunning games of strategy for your holiday fun, although it has to be noted that none of the games in this issue are actually Christmas ones. First up in this magazine, I'm going to take a look at all the Acorn related news for that month. The news section is pretty substantial and includes reports on a breakthrough for the blind with a talking spreadsheet for the BBC, a man using BBC Micro software to beat his disability, information about the Christian BBC Micro Users Association, a digital artist using the BBC Micro getting national recognition for his work, and the piece I'm most interested in, the BBC breakthrough that brings a £1 million order. This says that the BBC Micro has finally made its long-awaited major breakthrough into the North American market. An order for over 1,000 systems worth more than £1 million has been placed by the Ontario Ministry of Citizenship and Culture in Canada. Machines with disk drives, monitors and printers will be installed in community centres throughout Ontario, principally for use by school children. It goes on to say some of the centres in Ontario that will use the systems are so remote that the equipment will have to be delivered by helicopter. On that note, sales director Joe Black said the BBC Micro's reputation for fault-free quality was an important factor too. The report's rounded up by saying following this breakthrough and initial reactions to other BBC Micros on loan for trials in schools and universities throughout Canada, Acorn expects further orders shortly. I'm not sure those expectations ever actually resulted in a load of orders, but it is interesting to see what parts of the world this ostensibly British machine made it into. Having not found any articles of particular interest in this issue of the Micro User, I'm instead going to be focusing on adverts for the rest of this review of the magazine, and the first one that stood out to me is this one from Mushroom Computers Limited, who are advertising a new workstation setup for the BBC Micro to go into, but in a rather provocative way. As you can see, there's a glamorous lady, at least by 80s standards, draping herself over the unit, with the headline, "If you think the front looks good, you should see the back." I wonder exactly what they're referring to here. I don't really have any interest in what was being advertised here, I just thought the advert was amusing. The next advert I'm going to look at is more interesting though. This is for Replay, a unique hardware and ROM based system which is a must for all disk users according to the advert. It says here, the Replay system from Vine Micros is the only system that can dump anything in the computer memory to disk, and it also has a number of other extra features. It says games can be stopped and saved directly to the disk at any time. This means you can resume play from where you left off and don't need to work through earlier screens time after time. Stopped screens can be reloaded from disk and printed via a suitable routine, enabling a permanent record of those high scores. There's also the opportunity for game improvements and a pause facility. What really stands out here though is it says the Replay system will not turn you into a pirate, it solely provides a facility for an individual user, and that's because resulting disks are not recognised by a different computer. Now clearly if you read between the lines, this utility allows you to make copies of games and load them from disk instead of cassette, and that's exactly what we did with it in my household when I was a kid. There was actually a computer shop in a nearby town that rented out games. Essentially you initially bought one game and then you paid £1 to swap it out for a different one week after week. They knew exactly what they were doing and so did we, and with the help of Replay I managed to amass a pretty substantial collection of games over the years. I do recall that you had to have the Replay ROM installed in the Beeb to actually load the games, but I'm pretty sure the discs were transferable from one Beeb to another as long as you had the ROM. The final advert I'm going to look at before moving on to the games listing is from Superior Software, and it's on the inside back cover, and this is their advert for the sequel to Repton, which is obviously called Repton 2. More than just a sequel, it's a new experience, the advert says. And just like the ad for the original game that I showed a couple of episodes back, this one's got an artist's impression of the gameplay along with 6 screenshots. The write-up of the game says Repton 2 is a challenge even for hardened Repton addicts. Not only must you collect all the diamonds, more than 1,000 in total, you must also find the 42 jigsaw puzzle pieces that have been strewn throughout the 16 levels. The levels of play are connected by a series of transporters which propel you backwards and forwards between the different scenarios, but each transporter can only be used once. New features it mentions are meteor storms at the planetary surface, haunting spirits and eerie skulls of past explorers. Once again, Superior are enticing you to buy this game by offering a prize to the first 100 people that could complete the game. You'd win an exclusive I've completed Repton 2 cotton t-shirt, and you'd also be entered into the draw for a cash prize of £200. It wouldn't entirely surprise me if not all of those 100 t-shirts were actually claimed, because this game was incredibly difficult to complete. Time to move on to the final game listing for this episode and for 1985 then, and Paul Hobson asks, dare you step inside the wizard's castle? Well Paul, yes I dare to, otherwise there wouldn't be much point in me talking about it, would there? The opening paragraph says, in this game you play the part of an explorer who has accepted the task of rescuing the Lord and Master's diamond. It is the source of all the magic of the valley and has been stolen by the local evil wizard and hidden away in his castle. There's then a huge amount of backstory and also an explanation of how to play the game, but I'm going to skip over that because that'll all be covered in the instructions when I load the game. What I am going to mention though is this artwork that occupies most of the 2 pages, which is really nicely done with your hero on the left hand side, a number of different creatures and of course the wizard, who doesn't really look that evil to be honest. There are some useful tips too for anyone who was going to type the listing in. For example, it says there's no joystick option, but it could be added by patching OzByte129. It says the October 1983 issue of the Micro User shows the technique. It also says that when you've typed the program in, you should save it to tape or disk before running it. If the program reports an error, then you've made a typing error in the data statements, which are checksummed. It goes on to say it's advisable to check your typing very carefully if you're in a tape system, otherwise you can spend a lot of time saving and loading the program if you're an inaccurate typist. Finally, it says if you find the monster sprites move too fast, you only need to make one alteration, which is on line 610. Also on this introductory 2-page spread, we've got the typical box art that lists all the variables, but also another one that mentions machine code entry points, so I'm expecting this to be quite a complex listing. Those entry points include plotting the cave room, the square room, the sprite position according to X and Y coordinates, something related to the main game loop, something to print doors on the screen, and also something that moves characters around based on the way it's described there, with an exclusive OR plotting characters at a specific coordinate. As is typical for the micro user, the listing starts later in the magazine, this time on page 156. Moving to that page, you get the other box art you'd expect to see in micro user listing, describing the procedures and functions used in the game. The listing then begins and it covers 6 pages with a total line count of about 470. This is going to be another one that would have been hard work to type in because the last 2 pages consist entirely of data statements, though it did mention earlier that each one has a checksum at the end to let you know if you've typed it in wrong. Prior to the data statements you can see a bunch of machine code commands, and before that there's a procedure that prints the instructions on the screen, and prior to that is all the other game code, which for the most part is written in BASIC, though there are some other machine code commands scattered through it sporadically. With almost 500 lines, all those data statements and lots of machine code, I'm expecting this one to look and sound pretty good, but I wonder how it'll play. The game kicks off with a pretty basic title screen, giving you 2 options. You can press space to immediately play the game, or press return for the instructions. Choosing to see the instructions will present you with the first of several pages of information, and just as I did with Shuggy's Garden, I'm going to skip over these quite quickly in the footage and get to the gameplay, but summarise these for you while you're looking at that footage. The instructions say you're a mercenary explorer who's undertaken to find an amazing jewel. You've been taken to a castle deep in the forest, and a fellow mercenary has warned you of the dangers therein. Locked doors, strange rooms that have but one exit, and many hideous monsters of the night. There are also mysterious potions that will restore you to life, and you already have 3 of these, and acorns made of precious metals in all the colours of the rainbow. There are 4 levels you must explore to find the jewel. Upon discovering it, the evil wizard will be banished forever to the icy wastes. Your only defence against the numerous monsters is a zap spell you learnt from your master when you were an apprentice. Just like the majority of Beeb games, the keyboard controls are Z and X to move left and right, colon and slash to move up and down, and return casts a spell. Having now seen some footage of the game, I'm sure you'll have recognised that with its flick screen top-down view, respawning enemies and Spectrum-esque graphical style, this game is clearly influenced by Ultimate's Attic Attack and probably even more so Wizard's Lair, which had been released earlier in 1985. Graphically it's impressive, with a variety of wireframe drawn rooms and lots of different enemies, including ones inspired by other games such as Rockford from Boulder Dash and the Ghost from Pac-Man. It's got exactly the kind of noisy sound effects you expect from this kind of game, and an excellent score and live display area on the right hand side of the screen, just like the 2 commercial games I mentioned. The player character moves quickly and control is generally good, though he does get stuck by the walls sometimes. Gameplay is incredibly difficult though, with rapidly respawning enemies and tough collision detection. Enemies can often materialise right next to you and kill you without really making proper contact, and you can also walk into a new room straight into one with no chance to react. Your weapon works well sometimes, but others it doesn't go the way you expect it to, and death comes quickly with no way to defend yourself. It's frantic and panic-inducing moving around the castle with almost no time to assess what to do. You just have to keep moving and hope not to be killed. It's very inconsistent though, as in one attempt you might do quite well, but the next you may only see a few screens, and as a result you'll soon lose patience. As I said, it is a good looking game and seems to be large too, based on me only getting 3% through it, but it's just too hard to be any fun. If there were slower or less plentiful enemies on at least the first floor of the castle, that would give a gentler introduction. You may recall that the magazine mentioned there was a way to change the speed of the enemies, and I think that would have been vital to get any fun out of it. I never got to later levels, but I can't imagine it gets any easier if you do make further headway. Wizard's Castle is technically impressive for sure, but it's just as frustrating as those games that inspired it. The listing is long with lots of machine code, but if you knew your way around that language then it might have been worth the effort to type in and tweak that difficulty level, as there is the potential for a good game here. That does it for this episode of the history of BBC Micro typing games, and brings my look at 1985 to an end. As with the previous 2 episodes covering this year, there's been a huge improvement in the quality of the typing listings compared to earlier years. That of course corresponds with the improvement in commercial titles as the system came into its prime years for games. Of the games I looked at this time, all were quite impressive from a visual perspective, but the gameplay was lacking on the likes of Kung Fu Master and Wizard's Castle. On the other hand, Tex and Dan literally put a neat twist on an early arcade game, Quasimodo was a competent Hunchback clone, and Shuggy's Garden was a more original title with obvious arcade influences. All 3 of those games were well designed and playable for a short time at least, so might have been worth your while typing in back in the day, and are certainly worth a look now. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and let me know any thoughts you have about the games or magazines I've looked at. As always, the pinned comment on this video features links to both the games and mags if you want to explore them further. If you'd like to support my efforts and influence the future direction of this channel, please click on the join button below the video for more information about becoming a member. Having reached the end of 1985 and finding myself with less free time than usual at the moment, this series will be taking a break until sometime in the new year, where I'll start looking at typing listings from 1986. I will try not to leave it so long for the next episode though. I do also have plans to look at some typing listings for another popular computer of the 8-bit era, and that video may come along first if I can make time for it. Whatever happens, you can be sure of more retro gaming content of some kind on this channel, so please stay tuned. Thanks very much for watching this video, and until the next time, see ya!